This is the second video podcast related to the first presentation, the introductory presentation for HYD 143. At this point, you have a basic understanding of the logistics of the class, and now we want to move into the introductory concepts that you need in order to be successful. All the concepts I'm going to talk about now are things that we're going to come back to over and over again in the class. So if you don't understand these in this first presentation, don't worry too much. On the other hand, these are all relatively basic ideas, and it's essential that you get them over time. So you might want to look at other links that are on the introductory lecture web page for the course, or do a little bit of web searching on the concepts that you see on your own so that you can get a better understanding beyond how I'm presenting it. When we look at the landscape, such as what is shown in this aerial photo on your left, this is a false color infrared aerial photo, which is why you see pink and bright red indicating some kinds of vegetation. But when we look at a photo like this, one of the things you can see is that the land surface as we exist today in the modern world is a real patchwork of different components. We might call these patches habitats for an example, but I'll be defining that better later. In just the small region you see in this photo, you can see roads, houses, commercial infrastructure, perhaps some industry, large buildings, small buildings. You might see, some kind of a land clearance and open mining pits or something. We see forests, we see grassy fields, we see, highly nutrient watered grassy fields. There's swamps, there's estuaries, there's open water, rivers, distributary channels, a lot of complex features. And you can see that the landscape is divided by roads and railroads and rivers and estuaries. So it's a real patchwork. And as a result of that, when we face the environment as a problem, as professionals, we have to figure out how we're going to cope with that patchiness of the landscape. A basic idea would be to start by looking at each patch as if it's independent and really well characterizing what's going on in each patch. Or we could say each type of patch. Take advantage that some patches are alike, like they're all grassy fields, and other patches are all forests. Come up with one representation for each patch type and use that across all that type of patch. Then after that, we might need some way of integrating our patch level understanding, or we might have to come up with a completely different landscape scale way of assessing the environment. So the majority of this class is going to be involved with understanding individual patches in terms of their ecology and hydrology. Then, towards the end of the class, we'll move into a section in which we will look at landscape scale interactions. So as a starting point, we have to define the basic concepts of hydrology and ecology. And inevitably, when we try to make a definition, there's going to be some amount of unsatisfactory element. I'm going to present things in a relatively simple way, but then you'll get experience with them through time through the in-class activities. So if you've never been introduced to these ideas, this will be a fine introduction for you. If you have, think about whether you think I'm doing a good job or if you could do it better. And if you think you can do it better, then just pause the recording and say out loud to yourself the definitions that you think are better. Or challenge yourself to look up definitions online or through other resources and compare against what I'm saying. In terms of hydrology, we can begin with the definition that hydrology is the study of water as it is stored, as it moves, and as it interacts. The interactions could be with chemicals, chemical transformations. It could be biologically mediated interactions, or it could be human activities. And we can, whether we consider humans to be separate from chemical, biological, physical is a question unto itself. But for now, it's helpful to think of humans as fundamentally different compared to the history of what the Earth has been through. If we look at this simple diagram that comes from a textbook, you can see indicators of storage. We have the ocean down here. We have the groundwater table off on the left. We've got a lake. We have a snow cap. So these are different examples of storage features in the landscape. Then we have the flux representation, which is shown by arrows. It might be rainfall falling onto that snow cap. Snowfall or rainfall falling onto the snow cap or elsewhere. Evapotranspiration, it gets a big arrow because evapotranspiration is a big component of what happens to water. Infiltration, surface runoff, groundwater flow. These are examples of different kinds of hydrological fluxes. Now, the dirty secret about hydrology is that, in a very simplified way, hydrology is nothing more than accounting. So when you have your own dollars, you take your money and you store them in some places, perhaps a bank, perhaps in your wallet. Perhaps you have storage in the form of credit in different credit cards or bitcoins or something else. And then you're going to move that from one place to another. You might buy something online, you might deposit something somewhere, take something out, write a check, use a credit card. Those are the fluxes. And your money might interact. You might put it in an investment and it might grow or it might disappear without ever moving anywhere. Water really can function the same way by analogy. It's just that generally can't go negative the way money can. So one of the basic tools that we have as professionals in hydrology is a budget. And a hydrologic budget is a statement of mass conservation for water. To make a budget, you have to specify the area of interest, and you want that to be very well delineated. Engineers talk about using a control volume, indicating that it might be like a cube or something like that. Next, you have to figure out where the water is in that system, like what are the storage components that are associated with that. And then finally, you have to look at what the fluxes are. So let me illustrate this with two examples. In the first case, imagine a very small piece of land, a 1 meter by 1 meter square plot with just a 1 millimeter, very small amount of soil overlain by a very equally thin amount of air. So if we start with that rectangular cube, then we can look at the fluxes that are there. We just simply do basic accounting. And if we look at the bottom, we're going to write an equation that tells us that inputs equal outputs plus what's in storage. So in the crudest sense, the inputs in this volume would be P, which stands for precipitation. Very obvious. Now here's one that's not so obvious. Q, in this case, is usually used to represent discharge or runoff. However, in this case, it's representing the totality of any water fluxing in. There could be moisture in the air. There could be what we call through flow moving into the soil, or just water running on the surface, what we might call run on. We could similarly have flow going out. Again, could be moisture in the air or soil, or it could be run off on the surface. Then we have other loss terms. We have evaporation. We have water that vaporizes into the air and leaves as water vapor. And we might have liquid water or vapor water that's being pulled by gravity down deeper in the soil out of our control volume. So those are the fluxes. In addition to the fluxes, there's going to be storage, and here that's represented by SM. So there's soil moisture, and there could even be some air moisture, I suppose. So this is a good time to point out that it's very hard to do hydrology without using some kind of symbolization. So we have P for precipitation, Q indicating discharge, run on, run off. I'm using INF for infiltration right now because I could be a variety of things that start with I, like interception would be another example of an I. E for evaporation, and for right now I'm just saying SM for soil moisture. What about units? How do we quantify these in terms of actual numbers? These could be length scales like water depth. They could be volumetric or length fluxes like velocities, or they could be volumetric abundances or flux rates like cubic meters per second. So overall, again, this is the simple perspective of hydrology when it is simple, and that is to just do the bookkeeping. And one of the most basic things that people forget when they're practicing as hydrologists is to forget to just always start whenever somebody approaches you with a problem to begin with the bookkeeping. If you don't know anything else, you can always draw control volume and start doing the bookkeeping. And I guarantee you from there, you're going to get a lot of ideas about what you can do. So that's the place to start. Let's move up to the scale of what we would call a watershed, catchment, or basin. So by definition, this is a parcel of the land that is bounded in such a way that water cannot cross on the surface across that. So like the ring around here, this polygon is the divide, as we call it, and water cannot move across a divide by definition. If you haven't seen a divide or looked at either a topographic map or a photo, I encourage you to pause now, go onto the internet and do a search for watershed divide, and then look at some images. You could also try looking for mountain saddle or topographic saddle to see another form of a divide. So pause and do that. Assuming you've now seen such a divide, you would know that the only way water can enter a watershed is as precipitation. So water falls out of the sky. It could be rain, it could be fog drip, it could be snow or hail or whatever, precipitates down, and then that is balanced by storage and outflux. The storages would be soil moisture and depression storage. So depression storage means that if you have a depression on the land and water can accumulate in there like a little pond or something like that. The outfluxes would be, in this case now, not just evaporation, but because the land is likely covered with vegetation, we now talk about evapotranspiration. We might also have the larger scale equivalent of infiltration, which would be groundwater, and here you can see a soil bedrock contact. So we generally don't think of infiltration down below the bedrock. We think of that more as groundwater migration, perhaps. And then you can have surface runoff at the outlet of this catchment, stream flow. Okay, so that covers all of the inflows, outflows, and storage at the watershed scale. In terms of the process of actually collecting hydrologic information and advancing science in hydrology, there are a lot of different ways to go, one of which is to do experiments. And when you do experiments in hydrology, it usually means going to a field site and doing some sort of monitoring or manipulation. For example, here are some photos that show the Coweta Long-Term Ecological Research Site, LTER. And this is one watershed. You can see the divide on the left and the top and on the right. And it's a forested catchment, and it's been studied for over 70, 80 years. And you can see here it is before they did a clear cut. They characterized the hydrology. They then did a clear cut as an experiment and then monitored the outcome. And they also had control watersheds off in other locations that they didn't cut. So that's an example to show that you can do true experimentation in hydrology. Just note that this can't be double blind the way a drug test is, because the people who are collecting data, the scientists, you can't hide from them that they're collecting data on a clear-cut landscape. Another powerful tool that we're going to be playing with this quarter is hydrological modeling. There are many ways of doing modeling, and we're going to work with some of them in this class. A model is nothing more than a representation of reality. We often think of it as being a numerical model where we can actually compute or predict, but it could also be a conceptual representation, such as the one showed on the slide. And we use a model in order to understand the behavior of the real world. Models are often divided into those that we call deterministic, which means they're trying to represent real, non-random, trending or periodic functions that exist in nature, or they could be stochastic. Many things in the environment, people believe them to be random. And so, therefore, rather than trying to explain them with non-random functions, we can take advantage of probability and statistics and generate the same patterns using random numbers. In this diagram on the left, it shows a concept or conceptual model of a piece of a watershed, and you can see how it's broken down into discrete elements. And then for an individual element, you might have a variety of hydrological functions, and then that's repeated for every element on the landscape. Okay, so those are the basic introductory concepts I would like to put into your mind about hydrology. They're relatively simplistic so far, and we'll build from there. Now, in the course of teaching this class many times, it's become very apparent to me that I often have a habit of assuming that students know things in math and science that I often find out they don't know as well as we often expect. And so rather than just ignoring that and dealing with it later, it's best to have it at the beginning here and see what we can do. So the first thing that I've noticed is that students are not very often introduced to the idea of a log-log plot. Log here means logarithmic, and by saying log-log, we mean the x-axis is a logarithmic plot and the y-axis is a logarithmic plot. This happens to be a plot that has a lot of complicated information, especially if you've never seen a log-log plot. The reason why we show a log-log plot is because if you have data that spans a wide range of numbers, in this case, well, the numbers here go from 0.1 to 1,000. If you just use a regular plot with linear numbers, you can't see much across that full range. It's just too big of a range. Whereas with this type of representation, we can span it and see a better representation. Another reason to do this is that if the phenomenon you're trying to understand is not a linear function, but is in fact a logarithmic function or an exponential or power function, then it may be represented here as a line. And you can see that for the three examples shown. So the x-axis in this case shows the discharge or amount of water in a river, and then the y-axis shows different information. The left axis shows depth and width, which tends to vary from 0.1 to 100, and the right axis shows velocity going from 0.1 to 10. So you can see how this is being scaled to show different information in different ways. It's not really ideal because you can see that the hash mark for 1 is off from the rest of the line, so it's a little bit tricky the way that it's been shoehorned on here. So let's focus on the left side. So what I'd like you to do is to think about what is the associated depth and width when the discharge is 10 cubic feet per second. So depth is represented by the dark orange line, so you come up to this line and you have to read off the number, and then width is up here. And what you can see is that the numbers here are not that easy, because it's like, well, what, 10, and then what's this, 11, 12, 13? No. It's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. The numbers compress as you go towards the top. Units here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. So in this case, it's relatively straightforward, but you could make this even more complicated if we use scientific notation. For example, if I said that 1 is 10 to the 0, 10 is 10 to the 1, 100 is 10 squared, and 0.1 is 10 to the negative 1, so I'm putting that in like a power notation, that's when people start to get confused, and I'll probably be talking more about that with an example in class. Another concept is thinking about things probabilistically. One of the things that might come up in this class is I might ask you to represent the basic statistics of some data. One of the ways that we do that, drawing on statistics in hydrology, is using probability density functions and cumulative density functions. We can also call them probability distribution functions and cumulative distribution functions, PDFs and CDF. PDF might look like something that you've seen before. This is an example of a bell curve showing 3 different bell curves, but there's 4 of them. 3 of them are centered on 0 with different standard deviations, and another one is shifted to -2. A PDF shows the incremental increase in the amount of something, and the something here is x, and it varies from -5 to +5, and it shows the incremental amount over that full range. A CDF is not just the incremental amount, it's the additive amount. Starting at the smallest number, and summing as you go up, then you get more and more and more until eventually at some point you've got all of that variation and there's nothing more to add. So you're accumulating the information as you go to larger numbers, whereas in a PDF you're just looking at the incremental amount. So if what I'm saying isn't clear, I encourage you to pause now and go online and look up a PDF or CDF and try to understand it better. Okay, let's switch gears from hydrology and math to ecology. In some ways, one could easily argue that ecology spans hydrology, because ecology is the study of the relations among organisms and between organisms and their environment. The environment generally tends to mean the physical, chemical milieu within which the organisms are present. We also could talk about an ecosystem, and it's representing the preconditions for life to persist in a place. And so those conditions consist of two components. The physical chemical component, what we might call habitat, which is an assemblage of abiotic conditions, typically including water, energy, air, and land. But perhaps some of those might not be present in some contexts. And then the biota, which is the assemblage of living organisms that are present. Okay, now I'm going to break it down for you nice and simple. This is how I think of ecology at its most fundamental level. We begin ecology with an individual. So imagine Winnie the Pooh. He's just one little bear, and he's got a lot of things he needs. He needs to eat and sleep. He needs shelter. He needs to grow. And he might have to interact with other individuals. And then in part of that, he might be in a family, and his family might be part of a group. And we call that group of like individuals, all of the same species, a population. So for an individual population, we might be interested in the size of that population and the rate of change, any group characteristics related to, say, overall health of a community, like the epidemiology, so distribution of cancer or other physiological problems that they might have. And then if you have a number of populations together of different species, we could call that a community. The community, we might be interested in metrics such as the diversity, the number of different species that are present, that are there. And then we start to think about, if you have a community, what are the interactions between that community? And that's when we get to the ecosystem. The ecosystem is the assemblage of all of those different populations consisting of individuals and how they interact. And I like this because it basically shows, here's Tigger using the environment, hiding in there, and Piglet is behind here, and Winnie the Pooh, and they're all throwing snowballs at each other, showing how they're competing, hopefully not predating, but at least competing, and how the ecosystem plays a role. Sorry, I got a cramp. Hold on a second. Oh, that hurt. Okay, so we have this interaction of abiotic and biotic components of nature. And so it's important to remember across ecology and hydrology that life and water are inextricably interconnected. A change in one almost always causes a change in the other. However, I can tell you that in hydrology, there's generally been an underappreciation of the feedbacks that exist with biota. Conversely, throughout the history, there's been far more assumption in ecology that biological interactions are the dominant player in what happens, and that physical disturbances and physical conditions are far less important. Now that's been changing in both communities, but it's still a problem. I'll give you two examples. First, the most challenging flux in hydrology is evapotranspiration. When I provide you with a video podcast for evapotranspiration, you probably won't be very happy with it. It's pretty hard. But at the same time, evapotranspiration is the single largest flux in most cases. Typically 50 to 70% of all water that falls on the ground evapotranspirates away. So as a result of that, it's really important. And of course, evapotranspiration hinges on biota. As another example, there's a lot of work going on today to try to understand the impact of climatic change in hydrology and in the environment and ecosystems. But of course, many of the studies that you see will talk about how an incremental change in temperature or precipitation will have such and such effect. Oh no, the Sierras are going to have too much snowmelt, or not enough snowmelt, not enough snow, whatever the conclusion is. However, I can tell you that virtually all of those studies are fundamentally neglecting key ecological processes, most notably the importance of disturbance regimes and how disturbance regimes will change under climate. And as a result of that, most of the predictions you hear about in the paper are probably wrong and aren't very interesting, although people would like to make a lot of noise about them. Okay, so let's move on from there. A few more concepts in ecology, just as we had some in hydrology. The first is the idea of ecological succession. This is the concept that if you have a disturbance or some initial condition, then from there, the community that's present tends to change through time. And just as an example, if you begin with cleared land, there's often a seed bank present that will produce grasses that grow very quickly, and then that will see shrubs come into place over time, and give it enough time and competition and change, that might prepare conditions for trees, and then ultimately what would be called climax forest, which is climax in the sense that by outcompeting other species, then that distribution is going to be stable through time. Now, whether that is actually achieved, of course, is always long debated, but just I want you to be aware of this idea of succession. Next, we have what we could call hydroseral succession. So this is really important in hydrology, especially wetlands. The idea here, hydro, okay, basically means water-related. And so hydroseral succession means that there is a sequence of species along a gradient. And as conditions change through time, then the gradient may shift. And so at any one location, then the species will change. So for example, in this illustration, there's a lake, and there's going to be submerged organisms, floating, emergent, partially inundated shrubs, and then relatively dry trees. And so in this case, the shoreline may be advancing or retreating, and as that happens, then the distribution will change or succeed in response to the changes in the water inundation regime. The last big concept I want to talk about is disturbance. Throughout this course, it's going to be pretty important to recognize that disturbances exist in terms of weather, in terms of hydrology, in terms of geological phenomenon, and then that all affects the plants and associated processes. Both ecology and hydrology are heavily invested in understanding disturbances. We have events that occur with different intensities, durations, and return intervals, so we need to often characterize those regimes. Sometimes disturbances involve too much water, like floods and hurricanes, tsunamis. Other times they can be too little water, droughts, could be wildfires. And so it's very important to characterize the spatial and temporal scales of those events, which often are linked. So, larger scale events tend to occur less frequently, so we have that linkage there. And disturbances certainly change communities, but many people believe that they control them if they occur too frequently. So over the course of the quarter, we'll see many examples of disturbances and what their effect is on the different patches that we looked at. So for example, one disturbance was Hurricane Mitch, which grew to become the Atlantic Basin's 4th strongest hurricane ever, with sustained winds of 180 miles per hour, and it happened in October of 1998. The interesting thing is that this hurricane stalled off the coast of Honduras and just dumped a huge amount of rain and wind there, and it was responsible for over 10,000 deaths. This is an aerial photo that shows the way that they were built up against these mountain fronts, and there was this whole block here where there was a rotational slump and an earth flow that just snuffed out a whole community here, just buried people alive without them realizing it. So this is a hydrologically induced geological event. It impacted society. It changes the distribution and abundance of species. So that brings us to the final definition, which is ecohydrology. This is a relatively newfangled term that's getting emergently popular. There are a lot of different perspectives. The perspective that I'm bringing here is one that's at a relatively core scale. It's basically saying that we're interested in how water and biota interact in the environment, but typically at the scale of like a patch, so a forest, a wetland, an urban area, as opposed to focus on some people visualize ecohydrology more in the sense of just the physiological interaction between water and carbon, let's say, and how water and carbon flex through vegetation. That's not something we're going to focus on. There's some of that in the textbook, but that's not the scale that I'm going to be looking at. So ecohydrology may be defined as the mutual study of the role of biota in hydrological processes and the role of water in ecological processes. Historically, there's been a very tight link here in wetland science because of that hydroseral succession linkages and the role of disturbance. But today, we look into any landscape position and try to understand those linkages. So in this class, again, there's going to be a focus on the patch scale. So just to rehash, the overall goal of the course is to teach you ways of thinking about hydrology and ecology in different ecological patches on the landscape, and then extrapolating those insights to develop a landscape scale framework for assessing the environment from an ecohydrological perspective. By the time we're done, the thing you see on the next page won't scare you, and that's this. What is this? Well, it's a poorly drawn sketch of a channel and then a watershed with its drainage network upstream of that as a conceptual representation. And then we have hydrological fluxes on the left and ecological and other allied fluxes on the right. So this is nothing more than a water balance, but at this time that might be pretty scary to look at. And on the right side, nothing more than what's happening to biomass and inorganic sediments and minerals and what's happening. And so in this class, we're going to try to focus in quite a lot of detail on the left and blend in some ideas from the right. And these are the references. So that's the introductory lecture, and I will see you in class.